Boy confesses to teacher. Why he stays late after class, what she said, shocked the whole school. The final bell rang, its shrill chimes signaling the end of another long school day. The halls erupted in the usual chaos, but in Ms. Clark's classroom, a strange stillness settled over the room. The desks, once filled with chattering students, were now half empty. A faint hum from the fluorescent lights was the only sound, mingling with the distant noise from the hallway. Ms. Clark stood by her desk, gathering her papers with practiced efficiency, her mind already racing to the evening's responsibilities. But there was something about today that felt different. Something about the quietness of the room, about the way the light shifted through the dusty windows. It was almost as if the classroom, usually so alive with chatter and laughter, was holding its breath. In the back of the room, a lone figure remained. Jason. The 16-year-old sat hunched over his desk, his head down as he absent-mindedly tapped his pen against a notebook. His eyes, dark and tired, focused on nothing in particular. He was always one of the last to leave, though Miss Clark hadn't given it much thought at first. Many students stayed after class to finish assignments or catch up on missed work. But Jason, he was different. He lingered far longer than anyone else, his presence almost heavy. Ms. Clark had noticed the pattern over the past few weeks. Jason, always quietly seated at the back, never quite leaving with the others. There was no obvious reason for his solitude. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. His quiet demeanor had made him blend into the background. But this routine, this habit of staying late, had started to puzzle her. As she packed up her things, she couldn't help but glance over at him again. His posture was slumped, shoulders heavy, as if the weight of something invisible pressed down on him. A tight knot of concern formed in her stomach. She had been a teacher long enough to recognize when a student was struggling, even if they didn't speak a word about it. And something about Jason's silence today felt different. The other students had filtered out, leaving the hallway full of echoing footsteps, but still, Jason remained. Miss Clark watched him for a moment longer, torn between her responsibilities and the nagging feeling in her chest. She had always prided herself on being an approachable teacher, one who knew when to push and when to pull back. And this felt like a moment where she needed to step in. She hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk. Her gaze met Jason's for a brief moment, long enough for him to notice, but short enough that it didn't seem like an interrogation. The brief connection was enough. The moment was there. What was he hiding? She moved toward his desk slowly, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. Her voice, warm and careful, broke the silence. Jason, he didn't look up right away, but his shoulders tensed. She waited. The seconds stretched on, almost painfully long, before he finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. There it was again, something unspoken in his gaze, something buried beneath the surface. She knew that look. She had seen it in other students before. The same quiet desperation, the same weight that made a person shrink into themselves. "Why do you stay after class?" she asked, her tone gentle but persistent. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the edges of his notebook. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, hesitating. A long pause followed, each second feeling heavier than the last. Miss Clark took a breath, steadying herself. She knew she needed to give him time, space to say whatever it was that he had been holding back. And then finally, his voice broke through the silence, soft, barely a whisper. "I stay because I don't want to go home." His words hung in the air, a quiet confession, yet they hit her like a punch to the gut. The room felt colder now, even though the sun was still shining through the window. Jason looked down again, unable to meet her gaze. Her heart sank. She'd had suspicions, of course. Little signs she'd noticed over the weeks. The way he never talked about his family. The way he seemed so disconnected from everyone else. But she had never expected this. Never thought that a student, a boy like Jason, would feel this kind of loneliness. Jason's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he wiped them away quickly, ashamed. Ms. Clark's mind raced as she processed his words, the weight of them sinking in. She wasn't sure what had happened at home, but whatever it was enough to make him dread the thought of returning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt almost sacred, as if they were both standing on the edge of something fragile. The question that lingered in the air was clear. What do you do when a student's pain is more than just the stress of schoolwork? And that's when she made her choice. "You can stay as long as you need," Miss Clark said softly, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You're not alone here." His eyes flickered up to meet hers, uncertainty still lingering in his gaze. But this time, there was something else there, a glimmer of hope. It was small, but it was there. And that was all she needed to know. Before we dive deeper into Jason's story, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Now, let's continue. Jason was not the kind of student who drew attention to himself. He was quiet, reserved, and perhaps even a little invisible to the casual observer. His friends, if you could call them that, were few, mostly because Jason didn't put much effort into making them. He didn't dislike people, not at all. It was more that he found it easier to retreat into the background, to fade into the walls of his school, rather than try to fit into the expectations that were constantly placed on him. At 16, Jason was already beginning to feel the weight of the world pressing against his shoulders. There was an unspoken sadness in his eyes, a quiet exhaustion in the way he carried himself. It wasn't just the typical teen angst that seemed to plague so many of his classmates. No, Jason's problems were deeper than that, more complicated and less visible to those around him. He had learned to build walls around himself long ago, hiding his pain behind a mask of indifference. It was easier that way, but even in the darkest corners of his life, there were small moments of light, glimmers that kept him going. One of those glimmers was his love for art. It was the one thing that had always felt like his own. Whether it was sketching quietly in his notebook during lunch or pouring his thoughts into the canvas of a painting, Jason found solace in creation. He had always been a dreamer, even though it seemed so out of place in the world around him. At school, Jason was the kind of student who would slip into class just before the bell rang and slip out as soon as it ended. He didn't linger, didn't draw attention. He wasn't the class clown, but he wasn't the loner either. He was simply there. His teachers knew his name, of course, but None of them knew his story. None of them understood why he never joined in on the school events or why he always seemed to be in a rush to leave the moment class was over. Ms. Clark had noticed him early in the semester, mostly because of his quiet nature. Unlike the other students who were eager to participate or make their voices heard, Jason remained an enigma. He would nod thoughtfully during lessons but rarely spoke. His work was always turned in on time, always well done, but he never sought recognition. He didn't want the spotlight. It was this silence, this quiet determination, that made him stand out to Miss Clark in a way that others hadn't. She'd seen it before, students who were afraid to share their struggles with the world, who hid behind walls of pride or shame. But Jason's was different. There was a vulnerability in the way he withdrew, as if he were desperately trying to protect something, or maybe even someone. The setting of Jason's world, though, wasn't one of luxury or ease. His neighborhood wasn't exactly what people would call nice. It was a place where people worked hard for everything they had, and where hope often felt like it was in short supply. The houses were small, weathered by time and neglect, their lawns often overgrown with weeds. But despite the rundown appearance of the neighborhood, there was a certain charm in its imperfections. It was a place where people knew each other by name, but not necessarily by choice. It was a place where survival meant sticking together, even if it was in a quiet, unspoken way. Jason's house, a small two-bedroom duplex at the end of the block, was no different. The windows were cracked, paint chipped, and the front door had a tendency to stick, especially during the colder months. Inside, things weren't much better. The furniture was mismatched, hand-me-downs from family and friends, and there was always a faint smell of something burning in the air, as though something, somewhere, was always on the verge of breaking. Jason's mother, Sarah, did her best. She worked 2 jobs, one at a local diner and the other as a cashier at a convenience store, and still managed to make sure Jason had the essentials. But money was tight, and her exhaustion often showed. She loved her son deeply, but the weight of daily life had begun to wear her down. There were nights when Jason could hear her crying softly in the kitchen after he had gone to bed, though he never mentioned it to her. His father? That was another story. Jason didn't talk much about him, and he never asked where he had gone. All he knew was that his father had left when he was just a toddler, disappearing one day without so much as a goodbye. His absence had left a hole in Jason's life, one that no amount of love from his mother could fill. At school, Jason had learned to navigate this tension between his home life and his desire to appear normal to his peers. He kept his struggles to himself, never sharing the details of his home life with anyone. He didn't want to burden people with his problems, and besides, he wasn't sure how to explain it all. How do you talk about a father who wasn't there, a mother who was always tired, a home that was always on the edge of falling apart? It was in the quiet corners of his classroom that Jason found his escape. Ms. Clark's art class was different from every other subject. There was no judgment, no pressure to fit in. It was a place where Jason could let his emotions flow freely through his paintbrush or his pencil, where the world outside could momentarily fade away. The walls of the art room, adorned with various student works, provided a sense of comfort, an unspoken understanding that here, at least, there was room for creativity. Jason would often sit at the same desk by the window, his view of the schoolyard providing just enough distraction to keep his mind focused while his hands worked. But today, as he sat there alone after everyone else had left, the weight of his world seemed unbearable. It was as though the quiet of the classroom, usually his refuge, was now a reminder of everything he was running from. The silence in the room was suffocating, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped in a world that didn't quite understand him. His gaze wandered around the room, the soft light from the setting sun spilling through the window and casting long shadows across the floor. The stillness of the room was suddenly too much. That was when Miss Clark's voice had broken through, her warmth cutting through the cold isolation that surrounded him. Her question, simple and kind, was the beginning of something Jason wasn't prepared for. Jason's journey had only just begun, and the path ahead would be anything but easy. But here, in this small, weathered classroom, something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. And that realization, though small, was enough to begin the transformation he so desperately needed. Jason had spent most of his life hiding behind walls, but one thing he couldn't escape was the relentless pressure from his mother to get out of his shell. Her voice, tired but filled with a quiet urgency, would often echo through the small house in the late hours of the night. "Jason, you've got so much potential. You can't waste it. Please, show the world who you are." But Jason was afraid of being seen, afraid of revealing his weaknesses. In a world where strength was revered, where the ability to stand tall and never falter was the gold standard, Jason felt broken and unworthy of standing in the spotlight. It wasn't just his mother's persistent encouragement that made him uncomfortable. It was the weight of a deeper truth that lived within him. He wasn't just hiding from the world, he was hiding from himself. The tipping point came one crisp autumn evening, just after Jason's 16th birthday. His mother had been on him for weeks to sign up for the school's annual art competition, a prestigious event in the small town that could open doors to scholarships and future opportunities. But for Jason, it felt like a trap. Another moment where he would be forced to confront the world and risk failing once again. "Jason, don't you see? This could be your chance to finally get noticed," his mother had pleaded. She stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for their meager dinner, but her eyes, full of hope, never left him. "You're so talented. You could go far if you just give it a shot." But Jason couldn't see it. He was so used to failure, so used to being the invisible kid, that the thought of exposing himself in such a public way felt like an impossible mountain to climb. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the humiliation he had faced in previous attempts to succeed. The time he had tried out for the school play and forgotten his lines. The time he had entered a science fair and watched his project fall apart in front of everyone. He wasn't meant for greatness. He was meant to stay in the shadows, where he could make no noise and draw no attention. "I'm not doing it, Mom," he said, his voice flat and resolute. His mother stopped mid-chop, her knife hovering in the air for a moment, as if processing what he had just said. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face before she masked it with a forced smile. "You never even tried, Jason. You don't know what you're capable of if you don't take the chance." Jason turned his back on her, unwilling to engage in another heated argument. He didn't have the energy for it anymore. The truth was, he was terrified of the idea of failing yet again. Every rejection he had faced, every moment of failure, had chipped away at his self-worth, leaving him feeling like he was never going to amount to anything. He didn't need her disappointment to add to that burden. But the true source of Jason's challenge wasn't just his fear of failure. It was the weight of neglect that had followed him all his life. It wasn't something his mother had done on purpose, but the emotional distance she had put between them, in the wake of his father's abandonment, had left Jason feeling like he had to carry the weight of the world on his own shoulders. She worked tirelessly to keep their lives afloat, but in doing so, she became distant, caught up in the cycle of survival. The space between them grew as the years passed, until they were both just two people living under the same roof, not truly seeing each other. Jason's father had left when he was just a baby, a shadow that had never fully disappeared from his life. The idea of a father figure, someone to lean on, someone to give him advice, or show him the ropes of the world, had always been a fantasy. His mother was there in body, but emotionally she was often just as absent as his father. She worked long hours, and when she wasn't working, she was exhausted, drained by the demands of a life that had never been kind to her. Jason understood. He wasn't angry with her, but the loneliness he felt in their home was suffocating, and that isolation seeped into every corner of his life. Then came the fateful day when his fears would collide with reality. Jason's school was hosting the art competition, and Ms. Clark, his art teacher, had been encouraging him to enter for weeks. She had noticed something in his work that none of his classmates had: a raw, untapped potential. One afternoon, after the bell rang signaling the end of the school day, Ms. Clark approached Jason as he was gathering his things to leave. "You've got a gift, Jason," she said softly, her voice warm but insistent. "Don't let it go to waste." Jason shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "I don't think I'm cut out for it, Miss Clark. I don't really fit in with the others." Miss Clark smiled gently. "You're not here to fit in, Jason. You're here to stand out. But that won't happen if you don't let the world see what you can do. You'll regret it if you don't try." Her words echoed in Jason's mind as he left school that day. What Miss Clark didn't know, what no one knew, was the depth of his struggle. It wasn't just about art or school. It was about Jason's internal war, the fight between his desire to hide, to remain unnoticed, and the longing to be seen, to break free from the suffocating grip of his own self-doubt. As days passed, the pressure mounted. His mother, despite her exhaustion, kept reminding him about the competition. "Jason, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't let fear control your life. You have a chance to do something different." It was hard to ignore her. Her words felt like a burden he couldn't shake. And yet every time he thought about entering the competition, the same wave of fear washed over him. What if he failed? What if he was rejected? What if his art was judged to be worthless, just like everything else in his life? But deep down, Jason knew he couldn't keep running. The world would never see him if he continued to hide. He would never grow if he didn't take the leap. The challenge he faced wasn't just about winning the competition. It was about confronting the truth within himself. He had to face the parts of him that he had hidden away for so long. He had to stop letting fear dictate his choices. It was a battle he wasn't sure he was ready to fight, but it was one he couldn't avoid any longer. Jason spent the next few days wrestling with his inner turmoil. The looming art competition became the focal point of his world, overshadowing everything else. Each day he walked past the bulletin board in the school hallway where the competition poster was displayed, his gaze lingering just a moment longer before he hurried on. But the pull was undeniable, like a magnetic force pulling him in, despite every ounce of resistance he summoned. It was a Thursday afternoon when the unexpected twist occurred. Jason had just finished his last class of the day and was heading toward the art room to collect his portfolio. He had been carefully avoiding Miss Clark, not wanting to confront the reality of her persistence. But as he opened the door to the art room, he found her standing by the easel, speaking to another student, a girl named Emily, who was a known perfectionist in class. Emily was holding a brightly colored painting of a sunset over a mountain, her face glowing with pride. Miss Clark smiled at her, her hands resting on the top of the canvas, as if she was admiring it. But as Jason stepped further into the room, he heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. "I think you should enter this into the competition, Emily," Miss Clark said, her voice calm, but filled with a sense of certainty. "It's excellent. I believe you could win." Jason's heart sank as he stood frozen at the doorway. Emily, of all people. Jason had always known that Emily's artwork was technically impressive. Her brushstrokes, her use of color, her attention to detail. But to hear Miss Clark say those words felt like a blow to his already fragile confidence. In that moment, it wasn't just the competition that was at stake. It was Jason's sense of self-worth. He had barely picked up a paintbrush in years, and here Emily was, on the brink of winning it all. He turned and left the art room without a word, the seed of doubt planted deep in his chest. He could never compete with someone like Emily. She had the skills, the talent, the drive. He was just the quiet kid who stayed in the background, hiding his insecurities in his sketchbooks and journals. Later that evening, when Jason was sitting in his room, the familiar sound of his mother's voice calling him for dinner broke through his thoughts. He reluctantly dragged himself downstairs, his stomach tight with anxiety. His mother had been giving him subtle hints that he needed to take action, to stop making excuses, but he wasn't ready. He didn't have it in him. As he sat at the dinner table, his mother passed him a bowl of soup, her eyes searching his face. "Jason, are you okay? You've been quiet lately. Is everything all right?" Jason's fork paused mid-air. His mother's eyes were filled with concern, but also something deeper. Something Jason had always recognized as worry. She had been so preoccupied with her own struggles that she didn't notice the weight of his internal battles. But now it seemed like she was beginning to see through the cracks in his carefully constructed walls. "I'm fine," Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't convinced. "Jason, I know you're scared, but don't let fear decide for you. You're stronger than this." But Jason didn't want to hear it. The idea of confronting the competition, of putting himself out there to be judged, was too much. He couldn't bring himself to do it. Not with Emily out there. Not with the constant reminder that he wasn't enough. "I can't do it, Mom. I just can't," he said, his voice trembling. She looked at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding, but didn't press him further. Instead, she simply nodded, as if accepting his decision. But Jason could see the disappointment in her eyes, a look that pierced through him more deeply than any harsh words ever could. The next morning, as Jason made his way to school, he felt an uneasy sense of dread settle over him. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had made the wrong decision. The entire day dragged on, each hour feeling like a week as he tried to focus on his classes, all the while avoiding the art room, avoiding the competition he had once considered entering. But as the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Jason found himself walking towards the art room, against his better judgment. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the weight of his mother's words, or maybe it was the growing realization that he couldn't keep running away from the truth. When he opened the door, the room was empty, save for a single figure standing near the back of the classroom. It was Ms. Clark, her back to him as she organized a stack of art supplies. She didn't notice him enter, and for a brief moment, Jason stood frozen, watching her. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss Clark," she turned, her face softening as she recognized him. "Ah, Jason, I wasn't expecting you. I thought you'd decided not to participate." Jason shifted nervously on his feet. I wanted to ask you something." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I heard you talking to Emily about the competition. I don't think I can do it. I don't have what it takes." Ms. Clark's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. She walked over to him slowly, as if measuring her words carefully. "Jason, I never said you don't have what it takes. But what I did see in Emily's work was something I believe could do well in the competition. But that's just one path. There's another one, a path that's uniquely yours." Jason's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "Every artist has their own style, their own voice," Miss Clark explained, her tone soft but firm. "What you're missing isn't talent. It's the courage to show the world what you're capable of. And that's something no one else can give you. It's something you have to find within yourself." In that moment, Jason felt a shift within him. It wasn't a dramatic epiphany or an overwhelming sense of clarity, but it was enough, a spark of recognition that he had been fighting the wrong battle. It wasn't about competing with Emily, or anyone else for that matter. It was about stepping into his own skin, facing the fear that had kept him in hiding for so long. As he stood there in the quiet art room, the pressure seemed to melt away. He didn't need to be like Emily. He just needed to be Jason, and that was enough. But the twist didn't end there. As Jason left the art room, he received a notification on his phone, a message from his mother. He opened it, expecting a simple check-in, but instead, it was a picture of a letter from a college art program, asking if Jason would be willing to submit his work for review. He felt his heart race, uncertainty and excitement mingling together. His mother had sent it without saying a word, almost as if she knew all along what he was capable of. Jason stared at the message, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like the world was finally giving him a chance. But it wasn't just about the competition or the college program. It was about him, stepping out of the shadows and embracing his own potential, finally ready to show the world who he truly was. Jason stood in front of his easel, the quiet hum of the art room around him, offering little comfort. It had been 2 weeks since that conversation with Miss Clark. 2 weeks since the revelation that had ignited something deep within him. The competition was looming, but Jason hadn't touched his canvas since that day. He had made a promise to himself to be different, to push past the fear that had always held him back. But doing so wasn't easy. He had started the painting, a simple abstract piece, lines of vibrant color converging in chaotic harmony. It was supposed to reflect how he felt, tangled emotions, a restless mind, all trapped in a box of his own making. But as the hours passed, doubt crept in. He couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe he wasn't cut out for this, that his work, like his life, would never be enough. But this time, he didn't give in to it. This time, when the fear bubbled up to the surface, he breathed through it. He had done the hardest part. He had shown up. That, in itself, was a victory. Over the next few days, Jason found himself returning to the art room, sometimes with a sense of purpose, other times with a reluctance that was hard to shake. But each day, he painted. He painted through the self-doubt. He painted through the exhaustion. And slowly, the painting began to take shape. The lines were no longer chaotic. They were deliberate, powerful, each brushstroke telling a story that Jason hadn't fully realized until that moment. At home, his mother noticed the shift in him. She saw how he spent hours in his room, sometimes laughing at something on his phone, other times lost in thought. She noticed the change in his energy, the way he seemed to breathe with a new sense of determination. But it wasn't just the art that was different. It was the way he spoke, the confidence in his voice, when he said, "I'm going to enter the competition, Mom. I'm going to put my painting out there." Her face lit up with a smile that reached her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to take the leap she knew he had in him all along. "You're ready," she said simply, her voice filled with pride. Jason nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time, he wasn't doing this to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't competing to win or to impress Miss Clark. He was doing it for himself. The moment he picked up the brush again, it wasn't about winning. It was about claiming his place in the world, about accepting that he had a voice, a story to tell. The day of the competition arrived, and Jason stood before his painting in the crowded hall, surrounded by students and teachers who admired the works of their peers. But Jason wasn't focused on the others. He wasn't looking at the bright colors or the intricate details that everyone else had carefully perfected. He was focused on his own creation, and in that moment, it didn't matter if anyone else liked it. He had already won by simply stepping into his own light. Miss Clark walked by, her eyes landing on his painting. She stopped, taking in the bold strokes and vibrant energy. There was something about it that spoke to her, something raw and honest that she couldn't quite put into words. "This is your work, Jason?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Jason nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, it's me, finally." She smiled, and for the first time Jason saw the pride in her eyes, not because of the painting, but because of him. She understood. She saw what he had done, not just with his art, but with himself. She saw the transformation. The results of the competition came a few days later. Jason was at the diner, sitting across from his mum, absently stirring his coffee as he waited for the announcement to be posted online. His mind wasn't entirely focused on the outcome anymore. He had done what he set out to do. He had faced the challenge and conquered the self-doubt. That was enough. His phone buzzed on the table, and he looked down, his breath catching as he saw the notification. He opened the link and scanned the results, his eyes searching for his name. And then, there it was. His heart skipped a beat. The shock hit him like a wave, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He had won. But what hit him even harder wasn't the fact that he had taken first place. It was the realization that he hadn't needed to win in the first place. He had already succeeded. The victory was in the journey, in the courage he had found within himself to push through the fear. He looked up at his mom. Her eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table to take his hand. "I knew you could do it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jason smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "It's not about the prize, Mom. It's about who I became along the way." Weeks later, after the competition had ended and the excitement had settled, Jason stood in front of his painting in the school's art gallery, surrounded by students and teachers who came to see the winning pieces. The walls were filled with beautiful works of art, each one telling a different story. But Jason's stood out, not because it was the most technically perfect or the most colorful. It stood out because it was real. Jason had poured himself into that painting, and now it was a part of him that he could share with the world. It wasn't just a piece of art. It was a testament to his growth, to the battles he had fought, and the lessons he had learned. He looked at Ms. Clark, who stood nearby, her arms folded as she watched him. She had always seen the potential in him, even when he couldn't see it in himself. Now, Jason saw it too. "I think this is just the beginning," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. Jason nodded, a new fire lighting within him. "It is." The lesson Jason had learned was simple, yet profound. True transformation doesn't happen overnight. It comes from the willingness to confront your fears, to embrace your flaws, and to accept that your journey is just as important as the destination. He had begun this journey unsure of himself, hiding behind self-doubt and insecurity. But in the end, he discovered that the only competition that truly mattered was the one with himself. Jason didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be himself. And in that, he had found redemption, not through the applause of others, but through the quiet, powerful recognition that he was enough, just as he was. Jason stepped out of the art gallery, his footsteps light on the pavement, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't need to check it right away. The night felt different, more vibrant, as if the weight of the past had been lifted. As he walked down the street toward his neighborhood, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He hadn't gotten to this place alone. It wasn't just the art competition or the recognition that had made the difference. It was the people, the community, the shared moments of support and understanding that had transformed him. When Jason had first picked up a paintbrush, he had been on a solitary path, isolated in his own doubts and insecurities. He had kept his struggles to himself, afraid to share his true feelings with anyone. His world had been small, his circle even smaller. But as time passed, things began to change, slowly, then all at once. It started with Ms. Clark. She had seen something in him that he had never seen in himself. She had offered him a chance, a challenge to step out of his comfort zone. It hadn't been easy, but it had opened the door to something greater. Then there was his mom. She had always been there, a steady presence in his life. But now, there was something more. She had watched him transform from the shy, uncertain boy who avoided confrontation to someone who had finally found the courage to speak up, to claim his space. She had believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. It was her quiet, constant support that had grounded him and reminded him that he was never truly alone. And it wasn't just his family and teacher. It was the people in his community who had offered him encouragement, who had cheered him on from the sidelines, who had seen him as more than just a quiet kid who blended into the background. Jason had realized that the connections he had formed, small as they seemed at the time, were essential in his journey. They were the scaffolding that helped him build his confidence, his sense of worth. As Jason walked, he passed the local diner where he'd spent countless afternoons, a quiet observer of life going on around him. The familiar faces of the waitstaff and regular patrons greeted him as he entered, and he felt a warmth settle in his chest. There was a time when he'd felt like an outsider here, never fully part of the crowd, always keeping to himself. But now, there was a connection, a recognition that just like his painting, he was a part of something bigger. "Hey, Jason, how's the painting going?" asked Tom the cook, as he flipped a burger on the grill. Jason smiled, a genuine grin that came from a place of pride. "It's going well. I actually won first place in the competition." Tom's eyes widened in surprise, but his face broke into a grin. Jason felt a swell of gratitude. It wasn't just the win that felt significant. It was the acknowledgement, the recognition from people who had watched him grow, even from a distance. It reminded him that the relationships he had built weren't just about mutual benefit. They were about shared experiences and growth. When the waitress Maria came over with a coffee refill, she added, "You're doing great, Jason. We've all been watching you. You've really come into your own." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Jason realized that it wasn't just about the people who were closest to him. It was about the collective spirit of the community that had shaped him. The diner, the neighborhood, even the little interactions he had with strangers, they had all played a part in his transformation. Back home that evening, Jason sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in his hands, reflecting on everything that had happened. His mother sat across from him, her eyes warm with pride, but there was also a sense of quiet understanding between them. They had both weathered storms, faced hardships, but they had always had each other. "You know," his mom said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "it wasn't just the painting that got you to this point. It was everything. The way people cared for you, how we all supported you, even when you didn't think you needed it." Jason looked up at her, his heart full. "I know, Mom. I've learned that no one gets through life on their own. We all need each other." She nodded, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Exactly. The strength you have now is because of the people who stood by you, and you can do the same for others. That's how change happens. Through connection, through support, through the way we lift each other up." Jason thought about that for a moment. He had always viewed strength as something individual, something that could only come from within. But now he understood that true strength wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving together. It was about sharing the journey, the hardships, and the triumphs with others, knowing that no one was truly alone. The next day, Jason returned to the community center where he had first met Ms. Clark, the place where his journey had started. It had been weeks since he'd stepped through those doors, but today something felt different. As he walked through the front doors, he was greeted by familiar faces, many of them students he had never noticed before. They were all gathered for a small exhibition, a collection of art from the people in the neighborhood. As he wandered through the room, he realized that he was no longer just a spectator. His artwork was now part of the tapestry of his community, woven into the collective story they were all telling. The art on the walls wasn't just about individual expression. It was a reflection of the shared experiences, the struggles, and the hopes of the people who lived here. Jason saw pieces from people who had struggled with addiction, who had faced loss, who had battled with their own sense of self-worth. But each piece told a story of resilience, of growth, of the human capacity to overcome. Ms. Clark walked up to him, a smile on her face. "You're part of this now, Jason. You've contributed to something bigger than yourself." Jason nodded, a sense of belonging settling in his chest. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was a part of a community that valued connection, that understood the importance of supporting each other. As the evening drew to a close, Jason stood at the doorway, looking back at the exhibit. He felt a sense of pride, not in his own work, but in the collective effort of everyone who had shared their art. They had all contributed to something beautiful, something that spoke to the heart of what it meant to be human. It was a reminder that change didn't happen in isolation. It happened when people came together, when they offered their support, their love, and their understanding. Jason had learned that true strength didn't come from standing alone. It came from standing together. The bonds of community, the connections forged through shared experiences, were what made the world a better place. And Jason was ready to continue his journey, not as an individual, but as part of something much greater than himself. The evening had descended into a soft glow of streetlights and hushed voices. Jason stood in front of the art gallery, his heart racing, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the invitation. It wasn't just any art show. It was the culmination of everything he had worked for, everything that had led him to this moment. The gallery doors loomed before him like a portal to a future he wasn't sure he was ready for. But there was no turning back now. Inside, the gallery buzzed with conversations, the hum of people admiring paintings, sculptures, and photographs. Jason's eyes immediately found his work displayed prominently in the center of the room, a painting that had been born out of months of doubt, self-reflection, and frustration. It was a piece that had taken everything out of him, a manifestation of his inner struggle, his journey from darkness to light. The swirling colors and bold brushstrokes captured not only his passion, but the pain and hope he had felt along the way. As he walked through the crowd, he was acutely aware of the eyes that followed him. He had never been one for attention, but tonight felt different. People were congratulating him, admiring his work, but it was the voice at his side that stopped him in his tracks. "You did it, Jason." He turned to find Ms. Clark standing there, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. Her presence was a steady comfort in the midst of the whirlwind of emotions that was swirling around him. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice quiet but strong. You've come so far. Jason's throat tightened as he looked at her. The weight of everything that had happened between them, the challenges, the doubts, the late-night conversations, the guidance she had given him, settling in his chest. He had been so unsure of himself when he first met her, but now, standing in front of his own painting, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not just for himself, but for the people who had helped him get there. I don't know if I would have made it without you, Miss Clark, Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. You were the first person to really believe in me. I don't think I would have had the courage to do any of this without your push. Her smile softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. You always had it in you, Jason. I just helped you find it. In that moment, Jason realized that his success wasn't just about winning the art competition or gaining recognition. It was about the transformation he had undergone, the person he had become through the journey, the self-doubt, the isolation, the fear. It was all still there, but it no longer controlled him. He had learned to face it, to channel it into something meaningful. The sound of applause suddenly filled the air as the host stepped onto the stage, ready to announce the winner of the night's special award. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively glanced at the painting. Could it really happen? Could he actually win? The host's voice boomed over the speakers, and the winner of this year's Gallery of Dreams art competition is Jason Carter. A wave of shock washed over Jason, his mind struggling to process the announcement. His legs felt like they were made of jelly as the crowd erupted into applause. Slowly, almost in disbelief, he made his way to the front where the host stood holding a golden plaque. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt like he might collapse under the weight of the recognition. But then, as he reached the front, his eyes found his mother in the crowd, her face glowing with pride, and everything else faded away. Her smile, the one that had supported him through every trial, every setback, every doubt, was all he needed to feel grounded. As he took the plaque from the host, Jason felt a rush of emotions flood him. There was joy, yes, but more than that. There was a sense of relief, a sense of peace he hadn't expected to feel. He had done it, not alone, but with the love and support of so many people who had believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself. He looked out at the crowd, his voice shaking as he spoke into the microphone. I don't even know what to say, he began, the weight of the moment still overwhelming him. I never thought I'd be standing here. There were so many times I wanted to give up, when I thought no one would care about my art, no one would believe in me, but here I am, and I owe it all to the people who have been there for me. Ms. Clark, my mum, my friends, they helped me see that I wasn't alone, that art wasn't just about expressing myself. It was about sharing my story, my struggles, my journey. And through that, I found a community that sees me, that supports me, and that is the greatest gift I could ever receive. Jason's voice cracked slightly as he looked back at his mom, her face now streaked with tears. Her proud smile was all he needed to know, that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. A sense of belonging. The applause grew louder, but Jason could barely hear it over the thudding of his own heart. The pain he had carried for so long, the doubts and fears, suddenly seemed so small in comparison to the love and support he had surrounded himself with. The road to this moment hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had stood by him, who had helped him find his voice. As he left the stage and returned to the crowd, he felt lighter, freer, as though a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. His community had shown him that no one truly succeeds in isolation. The love and support of those around him had made this moment possible, and he was filled with a deep sense of gratitude that would stay with him forever. That night, as Jason walked home, the streets felt different. They felt more familiar, more welcoming. And as he looked up at the stars above, he knew that this was only the beginning. The journey he had started had led him here, but it would continue, driven not by the need for recognition, but by the desire to share his story with the world, to use his art to give back to the community that had given him so much. The emotional climax had passed, but Jason knew that this moment would stay with him, a turning point that would shape the rest of his life. And as he turned the corner toward his home, he knew that the real reward wasn't in the recognition. It was in the way he had transformed, the way his art had connected him to the people who had helped him along the way. The months that followed Jason's art show were nothing short of transformative. His paintings began to gain traction, not just in local galleries, but in the wider art community. It wasn't fame that he sought, but the connection his work had with others, people who saw themselves in his colors, in his strokes, in the raw emotion of his pieces. Every new exhibition, every new sale brought a sense of fulfillment that he had never experienced before. But more than the recognition, it was the healing that had taken place within him that filled him with the greatest sense of peace. The shadows of self-doubt no longer haunted his thoughts, nor did the fears of being invisible weigh on him. He had found his place in the world, not because of external validation, but because he had finally accepted himself. One crisp autumn morning, Jason sat down at the table in the diner where it all began, the same booth, the same coffee shop where he used to come, feeling lost, feeling unsure. He gazed out the window at the busy street outside, the same street that had seemed so overwhelming when he first arrived in this town. Now, it felt like home. He felt grounded here, a part of something greater than himself. Miss Clark, who had been more than just a mentor, had become a dear friend, often sitting with him over coffee, reminiscing about their first conversations, the doubts, the struggles. "You've come so far, Jason," she said one morning, smiling as she watched him stir his coffee. "I always knew you had it in you." Jason smiled back, gratitude flooding him once again. "I think I finally realized that it wasn't about doing it alone. I had to let others in, trust them, trust myself." His mother, too, had been his unwavering support throughout it all. They would visit the gallery together, and the pride in her eyes never faded. "I've always believed in you," she would say, wiping away a tear during each new opening. Jason's art wasn't just an escape. It was a way of connecting, of healing, and of sharing his journey with the world. His struggles, his triumphs, his vulnerability, it all poured into his paintings, touching people in ways he hadn't imagined. And through this, he found not just recognition, but a deeper understanding of the power of art to heal and inspire. As Jason took a final sip of his coffee and glanced out the window one last time, he realized something profound. Hope had never been as simple as waiting for the right moment. It was about believing in the process, in the people who helped guide him, and in the endless possibilities for growth and redemption that lay ahead. With the future in his hands and a heart filled with gratitude, Jason knew that he was just beginning to tell his story, and this time it was a story of healing, of love, and of the undeniable power of human connection. Jason's journey of self-discovery and redemption is a reminder of the power of resilience, trust, and the support of those who believe in us. It's easy to feel lost in the chaos of life, but just like Jason, you too can find your way, whether through art, relationships, or personal growth. What do you think about Jason's transformation? Have you ever experienced a moment that changed your life in unexpected ways? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences or reflections in the comments below. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and touch the heart. Together, we can create a community of hope and healing.